Hi everybody, so this is Eli from Elfbait, and today I wanted to talk about my Sunday game. It's the first session for my at-home game for my wife and daughter, my nephew, and a couple of their friends. So in this game, we are still doing 5th edition, and I ended up with kind of an eclectic group of characters. I ended up with 2 Genasi. One is a water Genasi, and the other is my daughter's hybrid fire and air Genasi. So we made her a para-elemental Genasi. We have one of the neighbor kids, he made a Dragonborn Barbarian, and my wife made a Goliath Ranger, and my nephew made a Human Fighter. So the Genasi are, the water Genasi is a Bard, and the para-elemental, we're calling her a Heat Genasi for the para-elemental plane of heat. She is my daughter's character, who is a Warlock. So that's the characters. You'll have to forgive me here. I don't quite have their names committed to memory yet. As far as the characters' names, I certainly know everybody else's names. But so the setup for this game, I wanted to be a little bit more dramatic, and instead of your typical sitting around in the inn waiting, to have everybody introduce themselves in a very awkward social environment, especially considering some of these kids are, middle school kids, and they're already in a socially awkward enough life. So just kind of figured I'd jump into it. So I had them begin by waking up. All of the characters woke up kind of from a groggy, stuporous, drugged state, surrounded by bars. They were in a like rocking cage of a prison cart, and they had been stripped of all of their gear and only had their basic clothes on. And they all had the one thing that they all did share collectively was their last memory before they blacked out and woke up in the cart was encountering and having a discussion with a man with a purple beard, sort of an exotic man with jewelry and a dyed beard and fine silks. And so as they sort of came out of this stupor, I described that from the cart that they were in, they could see that they were on a mountain road, high cliff to one side, cliff down to the other. And ahead of their cart was a procession of spearmen. Behind their cart was a procession of spearmen. And behind that procession of spearmen, another cart. And they could see far enough back, down the road, that there was another procession of spearmen behind that cart. There were also, seemed to be at the head of the column, they could see a man riding a horse. And so I kind of opened it up at this point just to see what they did, what do you do? And so we had kind of an introductory role play where they sort of woke up and asked questions of one another and realized that they had all come to this spot through a similar background. The Dragonborn, who is a copper Dragonborn and therefore can spit acid, started asking about the bonds, and so I described that the chains that they were wearing were very much prepared. They were iron. They were screwed tight, and then that screw was then fastened with a lock. So there was no unscrewing them or anything like that, and slipping out of them would be difficult. But the Dragonborn is a copper Dragonborn, and so he can spit acid. So he had the idea to spit acid on the links. Now, I did describe to them that the links were not welded or pinned, that they were simply crimped shut. So they're giving the hint if anybody got it, and I'm pretty sure my wife did. But I'm not sure if the other kids did that. They're that not being welded or pinned shut at the links, they would have a weak point. But the Dragonborn decided he was going to spit acid on his bonds. So I had him spit acid. He did some damage, and I described that he didn't break them. It didn't dissolve them altogether, but they were starting to deteriorate. So while he's doing this, and the rest of the party is discussing kind of what's going on as they're moving up the mountain, they're trying to figure out how they're going to get out. I know at one point, the Heat Genasi, my daughter's character, she decided to try and wiggle her way out, which she wasn't able to do. She wasn't able to pass the attribute test on that. So after the Dragonborn freed himself with assistance from the Goliath, so basically they took the 2 strongest characters and we did an assisted roll. He was able to break the link from his melted chains, and so he was free. And they had then did a combined roll between the Dragonborn and the Goliath to get the Goliath free. So now the two strongest characters are free. But at about that point, I start using their passive perception. I had them go ahead, and we figured that several of them heard this horse coming up from behind, and they looked and they saw this huge man in full armor with a great sword on his back and his helmet kind of framing his face, and around that helmet was framing a lion's mane that was attached to the helmet. He was riding, just thundering up the road, pushing his way past the procession from the rear of the column, and at one point kind of threw in that at a certain point one of the spearmen didn't clear the way, so this man just kicked him over the side of the cliff, kind of establishing the character of this individual. And so the party took note and quickly settled down and decided that they were going to make it look like they were still bound, and it was a wise decision. So procession continues up the mountain road. They're discussing things, and they see that there's a break in the rock. As it turns to the left, there's a break in the rock, and it looks like they're maybe entering a pass. And so they started formulating. I think at about this point, the players and their characters are starting to consider, how are we going to get out of this? What are we in for? There's clearly more than one cart full of prisoners. And so as they kind of wind up around, they realize that they're not going through into a mountain pass. It's actually entering into kind of a rocky glen. And as they enter in, I describe how the cliffs kind of come down and form this steep bowl. And in this bowl, there's a large structure kind of in the middle of it that's been overgrown by the trees that have grown here over the ages. And so the leading group of spearmen peels off to the left and forms up ranks. And then their cart moves forward, and the group of spearmen behind them peels off to the right and forms rank. And then the other cart that was behind them comes through and it parks next to them as that last group of spearmen forms rank behind them, blocking off the entrance to the glen. So there's then at that point, kind of let them mill about as they watch and see what's going on. And as they do, they see the armored man with the lion mane helmet and the man with the purple beard. They now can see that the other man at the head of the column was the same individual that they had spoken to before they had blacked out. And as they're watching, the jailer, one of the jailers from the cart, leads kind of a ragtag group of clearly prisoners and criminals. They're branded and scarred and disheveled and shattered, covered in filth. And they lead them to the opening of this structure, and this structure has a big giant snake head opening with just a black maw, where as the only visible entrance. And so the procession of men are given some words from the Lord up above, on the horse with the lion mane helmet, and they go in. And about 20 minutes later, there's just the echoes of screams and shrieks from the mouth of the structure, and only one of them comes out, and he's just covered in welts, and he's actually got a serpent attached to one of his neck, and he falls down dead. And so at that point, the party is afraid. And that's kind of all drama leading up to it. I wanted to give them sort of a reason to bond together, a moment to bring them together. I mean, they're all in this at this point, so they all have to start looking to each other for survival. Clearly, they're at a disadvantage. They don't have any of their equipment. They don't have any of their weapons. They've just got their own abilities. They now know what their purpose is. This cart of men was thrown into this, what looks like some sort of a temple or anything. It's kind of a stepped building. And, and sacrificed or thrown in there to try and test to see what's going on in there. So at that point, they are then kind of watching, and the man in the lion mane helmet, the nobleman as they start calling him, they're all sure that he's a knight or a nobleman, so they're referring to him as the knight or the nobleman, rides over and he addresses them. And there's this discussion where he starts telling them, he makes it very clear they're next, they're going in. However, their fate is slightly different. he makes it very clear, and there's a negotiation going on between the party and this nobleman, even though they're at a disadvantage. My wife kind of took point on this. Jen kind of took lead on this, and she's her Goliath is a giant. She's 7 feet tall and huge, and so she is not impressed by this nobleman, or at least she's playing not that she's not impressed. And so there's some back and forth. And the nobleman keeps throwing back at them the fact that they are free folk, even though he's got them in a cage. And so their fate will not be the same as these scum, these criminal scum, that he intends to give them. His intention is he's going to outfit them with their equipment again, which he has in another cart, and he will send them in there to what he explains to them is the sanctuary of the Serpent Sorcerer, an ancient structure that his scouts had found and that he has decided he wants to explore. But he's not willing to expend his own men, kind of pointing out to the character of the same guy who kicked a spearman off the cliff. So his values are mixed. He's rash. He will, so they kind of don't know how to read this man yet. But he's offering them a chance. He says he's going to give them 1 day to go in and explore this building and come out and tell what they found. But they have to stay in there a day. Now, in an interesting turn, the Goliath Ranger manages to negotiate with him to get 2 days. I think the idea was, the rationale there was that if they were undergunned or they didn't know what they were going to find in there, that they would possibly need more time, especially considering rests and stuff. There's not a cleric in the party, so downtime is going to be essential for them. So there may have been a bit of metagaming there, but you know what? It's all well and good because the characters are going to know their capabilities, and they've already discussed in the cart ride who each of them was. I mean, we knew that the Dragonborn was a barbarian warrior from the north, and the characters described their careers as, in character as they could. My nephew's character is he's a human soldier. He's a human soldier from Iron Keep, which is the northernmost border post for the vassalry of Aerlith to the south, and they're up in the Northern Baronies, the mountains of the Northern Baronies. They're actually in the Goliath Ranger's home territory, the mountains there. So she's familiar with the terrain. But so they bargain for the second day, and then they go to the cart. They're led to the cart to get their equipment, and after they get their equipment, I described that it was a supply cart and stuff, and so they'd inquired what else was in the cart. I think the idea was, is there anything else we can take in here with us to improve our chances? So I described their food. There's food. There's wine. They're basically rations, and so they take some of those, and they distribute the food amongst themselves, for 2 days worth of food. That's cool, reasonable. And then also, kind of in a grim bit of foreshadowing, I think some of them may have got it. There were a series of stakes in the cart and a cask of pitch. And when I describe the stakes, we're not talking about just defensive stakes. These are large, stick in the ground, caber-sized stakes that in my mind, I'm thinking, burn at the stake type of stakes, and a cask of pitch. So the Goliath actually takes the cask of pitch, figuring it might be useful inside, and actually has, and then also distributes 2 of the poles amongst the rest of the party, the stronger members of the party. And so they go in. Now they're very careful as they step in. They had seen what had happened to the vagabonds that were sent in, and they weren't really quite willing to just charge willy-nilly in there. It's a big black opening. There's really no visible light that they can see from inside. They can't really look inside and see. So as they get closer, they stop and they check, and they notice that there are 2 overgrown arrow slits, one to each side of the main entry. And I had them through a perception check. They noticed some movement behind there, so they looked in there, and they realized that in the room to either side of the opening, there are bronze-clad skeleton warriors, skeletons with bows. And so the skeletons notice their movement, and being dumb undead, they just start throwing arrows and stuff. And so rather than stick around and fight those, they move on. They're like, okay, they can't get to us. There's just an arrow slit. It's overgrown. They're firing blind. Let's just move on. But now they know that there are some undead, at least some undead in the form of skeletons within the structure. So they move on, and it's dark. So once they get past, I describe as they're getting through the fading light that there are carvings on the wall. Very intricate, slithering patterns and carvings of men and the like. And so some of the party have dark vision, some of them do not. And so until they needed them, they didn't pick up any torches. And so the dark vision, the two Genasi took point because they have dark vision. Not to mention they have natural spell-like ability. They have spell abilities and stuff. So even though they're the bard actually has, there's a bard and then there's a warlock. So they have spells, but also the Genasi have some spell-like abilities. So they're taking point with their dark vision. And in this particular winding passage, I describe how it winds to the left and then back to the right and then to the left. The carvings in the wall become more and more intricate, and they start to realize that these carvings are showing these giant serpents devouring processions of men and kind of a sacrificial scenes. And so there was at that point I had them all do a wisdom save because what they don't know is that there is a bit of magic going on here. And so a couple of the party members, my nephew's character and my daughter's character, so the Genasi and the human warrior, they failed their wisdom saves, and they kind of fell into the effects of like level 2 exhaustion. They were kind of in a stuporous state. They were stumbling, they were slowing. But I also wrote down on a piece of paper a word that came to their mind, and had them both look at it secretly. And this word was Athrax. And so didn't tell them what it meant, just a word. And so as they walk down, they finish with the passage, they see up ahead, there seems to be a steady glow at the end of this passage. And so I described that it didn't flicker, and it was very regular, so clearly they're not looking at torches or candlelight or lamplight or anything like that. And as they come in, they didn't enter the room. They were smart. They didn't just walk straight into the room. As they come to the end of the hallway, I describe sort of a large, it's about 20 by 30 foot room, something like that, 40 odd shaped room. And at the far side of the room, this open room, are two large copper doors, or bronze doors, excuse me, two large bronze doors, each with depictions of a snake seal on them. And then in front of them, coming from the wall, are two great sculptures of serpents that coil to form a barrier in front of the doors. So the party starts planning at this point. They realize that they have magical light in this room. There are two orbs up above in the back set into the wall that are providing the light in the room, so they can see. And so the Dragonborn decides that he is going to move very slowly through the center of the room, and the human soldier and the Goliath Ranger start to skirt around the edge of the room, keeping to the sides. And the two Genasi are going to stand ready at the door. One of them has a crossbow, and the bard is going to stand ready to inspire if needed. So they're thinking tactically, so I can get behind that. As they move forward, once the Dragonborn reaches to about 5 feet of the sculptures, I described how they fade from their stone color into life, and they actually come together and they form this giant snake, this huge snake with a head at both ends. So combat begins. They're fighting. They're doing some damage, and it's kind of going this way and that. And, the Dragonborn is front and center, so both heads are mainly focusing on him. And I have to say, I was trying to be very fair and rolling the dice, out in the open here, and letting the dice fall as they may. So the Dragonborn took a hit from one of the snakes, and as he took a hit, it's a crit. One head does a crit, and it's horrible. It's kind of cringeworthy because technically this is enough, potentially to take down a first level character, even a barbarian. But then I roll horribly for the crit, so I ended up doing like 4 points on a critical hit from the snake. The other head at the same time in the same strike manages to fumble. And at that point, they had done enough damage to the serpent, this giant serpent, to where the fumbled head, I decided, tried to bite the dragonborn that bit the serpent, and actually did in the last few hit points. So they had a bit of a comedy moment as this giant door guardian, kills itself effectively. Not something I like to do too often, but the dice were there, so I decided to play with it. At that point, the serpent turns back to stone and crumbles, and the jeweled eyes from within the snake sculptures clatter across the floor. So, of course, there's a mad scramble to take the jewels. The party now has some big old hefty jewels to carry with them, and a strength check is used to open up the door, the double doors, and they open into another, even larger chamber. What the party doesn't realize here is that really, if you go straight into the mouth of this structure, it's a temple structure. So there's basically a lead procession to the central chamber. There's a straight run right to this main chamber. It's guarded, and so it's certainly not an easy task necessarily. But so they've opened this chamber, and it's this huge chamber. I described how there's another similar serpent sculpture. So they're like, oh my God, there are statues of serpent helmeted warriors in two of the corners. There are a couple of staircases going up to an upper level with a wraparound balcony, and there's a dais behind the serpents, above which are coiled columns forming 4 posts of other serpents. So at this point, they're taking all of this in, and then I describe how the entire floor is writhing with snakes. Of course, they instantly make an Indiana Jones reference, which, of course, how can you not? But this gets the party thinking again. So they've got a room full of snakes. They saw how one of the men came running out of the front of the temple, with the snake hanging off his face. They also come to a horrible realization at this point. Why haven't they seen any of the bodies of the other ragtag men? So there's a moment of pause. They're like, what happened? Who took the bodies? Where are the bodies? So they start speculating. Did the snake guardian swallow them? Perhaps they've been carried away by something else. They know there are undead in there, so it's possible that that they were dragged away. And by now, the party's been in the sanctuary for about an hour of game time, and so they start to plan. The bard uses speak with animals to try and talk to the snakes. At first, she tries to convince the snakes to clear a path. She fails. They don't listen, and so she actually tries to threaten the snakes, explaining that if they don't get out of the way, they're going to burn them using the pitch that they still have. Earlier on, they had tried to use the pitch against the serpent, but the cask hadn't broke. It's a sturdy cask. It's a transport cask. It's not a grenade. So they still had it. It was slightly rickety now because it had been shaken, but it was still holding its integrity. So they have the cask of pitch. And so the snakes still don't listen. I mean, there's a room full of them, and there are then 5 adventurers. So at this point, there's really no good reason for them to listen, and so they decide that they're going to. So the serpents still don't listen. So at this point, they then throw the cask of pitch out into the middle of the room, or in front of them in the room, and the Heat Genasi uses a firepower that she has, to ignite it. A bunch of the snakes are burned. There's then a loud hissing sound, and just a cacophonous, chorus of snakes. And they see that at 4 spots in the floor, the snakes are starting to coalesce into, kind of rise from the floor and they form these humanoid forms that start to lurch forward towards them, and it starts a battle. At this point, they start pulling out everything. The Genasi are trying to use their powers. The bard is actually using inspiration. That's what she's using here, so using it fairly well. They fight. They're bludgeoning these serpent forms. They're taking damage. The serpent forms are just swinging wildly and clumsily. Actually, the serpent forms are really just reskinned zombies. I use the zombie stats, but thematically, I just changed it to where they were these masses of serpents rather than undead flesh. Kept the stats identical. So they're doing the slam attacks, and the only thing I didn't use is the undead fortitude. I had planned to, but seeing how the battle was going, I decided to dial it down a bit, kind of change the barometer on the encounter. And so they fight through, and the Heat Genasi casts the Black Tentacle spell and actually batters one of them to get to apart. And so we had to kind of end after this encounter. So, I mean, unfortunately, there's not too much to report for this first session. It was a 4-hour session. We had a slight interruption due to some household stuff that had to be taken care of that came up. But, I think all in all, there was, we had some good observation checks. We had some good role playing. There was a sort of a puzzle. They missed the puzzle. They had the word that they had been given while in the stupor was actually the password to get past the stone snake guardians at the doors. Nobody thought to speak it at all. I don't know what the internal processes were. There was no open dialogue. So the thought there was to give them a word and see what they did with it. So if they, at that point you kind of force the players to ruminate. Is this a good word that we should say? Or is this a word that we shouldn't say? Is it going to get us in trouble? So I don't know what happened there. But we had to stop at that point. And so at this point, they have reached the inner sanctum of the sanctuary within 3 encounters. There's now, at this point, there's they still have the rest of the sanctuary to explore, but they have time. During that first battle, the Dragonborn did go down. No, excuse me, not the Dragonborn. Dragonborn's fine. Pardon me. It was actually my daughter's Genasi character took enough damage to go down, but she's not out. She's not dead. She did pass her first death save, so she's okay. She's not gonna die yet. But one of the reasons they negotiated for that extra day of time inside was so they would have time for dealing with non-magical healing. So it's going to be interesting to see where they go from here. They still have a strong party. They've actually proven themselves able to coordinate combat and think on the fly and come up with alternatives besides just fighting. So I'm actually feeling quite good about this particular gaming group. Now, of course, my wife is an experienced gamer. She has, certainly some impact on their performance, and my nephew has played quite a bit too. He's in a campaign at his school. My daughter has played a few times, but not as much as my nephew. The Dragonborn's player has played other RPGs, but not 5th edition D&D. And the other Genasi player has played D&D in the past. So nobody's brand new, so that's cool. But it looks like we have a party, and we'll see. I found it funny, one chuckle-worthy bit that I forgot to mention earlier. In negotiating with the nobleman, he let slip the name of the man with the purple beard, at which point the whole party unanimously demanded that as part of their deal that they get a moment with the man in the purple beard, as they're calling him now. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes in. And honestly, I'm kind of curious what the party and the players are figuring that the end game is here. I mean, they've still, even if they clear the sanctuary, they've still got only the word of this nobleman they never met. The human soldier did recognize the style of his armor, which he had, they had the lion mane helmet, but he also had a lion's head emblazoned in relief or set in relief on his breastplate, and recognize that he is armored in the style of the northern baronies, the breakaways from the old kingdom of Erlith, who didn't come back into the fold when the vassalry was formed. So there is some expectation he can play. I'll let him play on that if he wants to do some insight checks and kind of figure. But yeah, I mean, even if after they clear out the sanctuary, if they get through there and they clear it out, they still have to come out of the building and hope that this nobleman honors the deal that they made, or they need to find some sort of alternative for what they're going to do when they come out. I mean, that there's no way they're fighting their way out. That nobleman is out there. He's got something like 60 spearmen. We figured as I was describing it, and himself, and the players keep referring to the man in the purple beard as a wizard. They assume he's a wizard. I described him. He's got silk robes and kind of a goofy hat, and he's got lots of jewelry, and he's dyed beard. So he's very, very eccentric, and I think that just sung wizard to them. But yeah, so they're in the sanctuary of the Serpent Sorcerer, and we're going to see what this heavily alliterated dungeon can offer them. There are some fun to come. There are still plenty of interesting encounters. At least I think they're interesting, and we'll see how they handle them. Thanks for tuning in, and this is this is the recap. This has been the recap of the first session of my Sunday game, and tonight I get to run the second session of my Monday game, and it looks like I'm going to have all three of my players show up. So we'll see if we can see if we actually get into the nitty-gritty about facing off against the Red Hand Bandit Brotherhood and seeing if they can retrieve Val Morgan's ledger. Everybody have a great day. Thanks for tuning in again, and get out and game.